Yeah, and I pulled down an article which I have on my Kindle here, but yeah, so you've been very helpful for me in terms of giving me a historical perspective on the whole co-op movement. Because I knew there was a history of black folks in this, but I just didn't know where to look.
Right.
You know, so I
well,
appreciate
it was really, in terms of the research strategy, it was really what they call the snowball effect. I just had the one entry point, which was Du Bois from some of his writings. And luckily, Du Bois is not only a prolific writer, but he was an editor of a magazine for 30 years. So that's really where I was able to find the first real proof that something was going on.
Didn't you do Phylon too?
Yes. That's where the
crisis.
Phylon, he did do Phylon too, and that's actually where one of the other really important studies I got, the John Hope study, was from Phylon in 1940.
That one was at Atlanta University.
Right. So, you know, thank goodness for that. But when I did the searches, I would come up with that co-op education stuff, you know, black co-op education, which is when an industry gives you an internship. They call that co-op education, right? So that's what I was finding out, like black schools that did that kind of thing. And so then I realized I couldn't search on the internet until I actually had names of things to search for. And even then, there's still not that much on the internet, because a lot of those files just aren't. They're still, if they're anywhere, they're still in people's papers, you know, in the back room of the Schomburg or somewhere in the Library of Congress, but not, you know, not that well, no. So it really was just hearing little by little, piecing things together, and somebody else telling me. Then I started reading black autobiographies, because I also figured if somebody's name showed up somewhere, then I needed to read their autobiography to see. And of course, it's only like a half a page, but at least that also gave me another lead or gave me some more insight into what they were doing, that kind of thing. Stephen?
Oh, I just, the interactions between this cooperative movement and the perhaps larger cooperative movements going on in the 40s and the 60s and the 70s, you painted kind of an isolated picture.
Right.
Was there sort of skill building or financing that came from, you know, white cooperative movement or?
Right. There's a mixed history there. I didn't find a lot of financing, but definitely skill building. And mostly from the side of the black co-ops talking about it. There wasn't a lot of stuff from the white co-ops, but the one interesting thing is Du Bois got the president of the Cooperative League of the USA, that's what it was called, it's now called the National Cooperative Business Association, but in 1918, Cooperative League of the USA president was James Warbucks, and Du Bois got him to write an article for the Crisis magazine about cooperatives and why they would be good for black people. So he's right there with a note about who he is. The Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters required reading was to read some of the co-op magazines and to read some articles from the co-op, from the white co-op movement. Some of the early, not early, but in the early 1930s, I guess this was, some of the black co-ops were actually going to the CLUSA conferences, because CLUSA had these annual conferences. So you see like the, the West Virginia co-op, Bluefield something. I can't remember what they were called. But anyway, this was a youth co-op actually, a student-run bookstore, book and supply store at the Bluefield Colored School. They actually, their director wrote an article in The Crisis talking about how they went. They were the first black co-op to ever go to one of these CLUSA conferences. So you have that kind of cross-fertilization. Nannie Helen Burroughs, the one who did Cooperative Industries in D.C., she was actually on the local D.C. co-op committee. And there's letters from her, from CLUSA to her, asking her to come speak at some co-op meetings and to make sure that she came to certain of the meetings and conferences, but also they were asking her to come speak at something. So there's that kind of thing. Helena Wilson, the head of the Ladies Auxiliary to the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, she was invited to every Chicago co-op event for 25 years, because she was considered basically the woman co-op person. She helped to start the Chicago Eye Co-op clinic, and you see her, these invitations to her to all these little co-op conferences that Chicago had, the white ones. So you have that kind of thing. And then actually one of my favorite finds, and I just found this like 2 years ago, in the Journal of Negro Education from 1939, it turned out that Columbia University had a summer course in 1937 or 38. 39 people? No, it was more than that. Sorry, I got this wrong the last time I talked about this. I think it was 47 people. 39 of them were white and 17 were black. Does that make 47? Whatever. Anyway, there were about 17 to 18 blacks, around 30-something whites, and they all went to Nova Scotia to study the Antigonish cooperative movement. This is out of Columbia University in 1937, an integrated group studying co-ops in Canada. For 2 weeks, I think, they went. So there was an interesting article about that. The president of then one of the black schools in Baltimore actually wrote up a whole interview he did with Cody, Father Cody, who was the sort of guru of the Antigonish movement.
Morgan's, they call it?
No, the other one, Coppins.
Coppins.
Right, the then president of Coppins State went on that trip and wrote an article about his interview with Morgan. So those kind of connections. So really interesting, but in some ways tangential, though clearly continuous, right? So it's not like it only happened one time, but it wasn't totally integrative.
Are there significant similarities or differences between the white co-op and the black co-op?
Well, the similarities are the easy ones. People who saw a need and were dealing with market failure come together to address the need, not wait for other people to figure it out. Those are similarities. Almost every group, not just white and black, but Latinos, people from all over the world everybody does. You come together collectively, you figure out a collective solution, especially when the other economic structures that are mainstream aren't supporting you. The things that are different in the U.S., a lot of the white movement was really white middle-class people who already had some resources, trying to augment their resources and do better. So even the white farmers and the whole white farmers movement, which is huge, both in the U.S. and, say, Canada, but they already had land. They were already landowners. They already had things, but they were trying to get better prices for their stuff, supplies, etc. For blacks, there was less of that and more of having nothing, trying to get something. And so pooling your very meager resources to get you to a point where you had something that you could then leverage to make more of it. So often, it might still be, sometimes you had black landowners, but often you had black workers who wanted to be landowners, or black landowners who were barely making it, or they were sharecroppers and trying to be landowners, and so coming together to make it work. And so that's why in some ways there was lots of sabotage and antagonism to their doing it, because they were trying to do something when the powers that be and the white supremacists wanted to keep them down, right? They were trying to rise up, so people were going to be against them. I mean, so that's really the biggest issue, is that issue of what resources you controlled and then what you were going to do with the co-op. But otherwise, it's fairly the same, pretty much the same relationship. I mean, the other thing that might be different for the blacks and the whites is a lot of blacks were not as literate as whites. So often the study groups and things, I don't know if all the white co-ops started with a study group, but all the black co-ops started with a study group. So definitely people realized they had to come together and learn together first and then start business.
Can I ask you a two-part question? The first part is, with the work you did in research for your book and as you were writing it, what was something that you didn't expect that surprised you came across? And the second question is, what's your favorite thing about this work?
Okay, the surprises were, I didn't know there were going to be so many. I didn't know they were going to be so integrated into the whole long civil rights, black liberation movement. I didn't know black women were going to be so prominent. And I was going to say I didn't realize how much they would be under assault, but maybe that's not true. I think once I found out how much under assault they were, I wasn't surprised, but I don't think I was expecting to find that. So those are probably the major surprises. Sorry, what was the other question?
Your favorite?
Oh, the favorite part.
That's a hard thing.
Yeah, I mean, I like so many, but, you know, Freedom Quilting Bee, I love that co-op. It's just a really great example of the whole point. And I was really excited about all the black women who were actually had leadership and initiating roles in what was going on, and that they were coming from long histories of some kind of involvement, even before they were involved in co-ops, and that they were able to do it, right? They weren't stopped from doing it.
Thank you.
When you use the term market failure, what do you mean?
It's, I guess, an economist term. We like to use all these terms that everybody hates. It means that the free exchange of goods and services didn't happen in this case in a way that made it profitable for a commercial company to do the activity. So I think I already gave the electricity example, but that's almost the easiest way to look at market failure. Rural areas, a commercial electric company usually will not go into a rural area and put in electric wires. Why? Because the population density is so wide, you place a lot of money on the wiring and few customers. So rural places don't get electricity. In our country, they solved it with co-ops, actually. So that's why we have this huge, actually it's a huge billion-dollar industry called the Rural Co-op, what are they called? National Rural Cooperative Association, and that's made up of whatever it is, 500 local, rural, or regional rural co-ops. And so what happens is in the co-op's case, you get all the people in that whatever 100-mile area or 200-mile area who didn't get electricity. They come together, they form a co-op together, and the co-op's purpose is not to make a big profit. The co-op's purpose is to provide them electricity. So the co-op figures out how to get the lines in there in an affordable way that everybody in the membership can get electricity, and then continues to serve that population at an affordable price without worrying about...
The market's not supposed to talk.
Right, so in that case...
Competence.
Right, so the market, the quote-unquote market, meaning private enterprise, wouldn't do it because it wasn't profitable. That's the failure, right? The market, which is supposed to deal with all these issues, failed in that case because no one thought it was profitable to do that business.
Right.
And for co-ops, that's why we say co-ops are about need, right? The co-op purpose of the co-op is to serve people's needs, to figure out an economic way to serve people's needs, particularly by having them all pool together to get that need met.
Yeah, because I think, you know, certain industries, I don't know if the so-called free market notion is the best notion. For example, medicine. I mean, I'd love to see us go back to the mutual aid societies for insurance, for example, because you know, if you're dealing with a corporation, their primary motivation is profit, and so you know, in many cases, they're trying to figure out ways not to pay you instead of or not to help you. Whereas, you know, with a cooperative model, you know, you have people who are more, I guess, apt to, you know, solve your problem, basically.
Yeah, absolutely. And there are some health co-ops, health insurance co-ops. In fact, even Obama's new law actually allows for health co-ops. I think that I read somewhere 23 health co-ops were created around the country through Obama's law, because it has an enabling legislation to support that if a group wants to do that. At least, but some state, the state has to accept that legislation. Not all of them have, but with the states that have, some co-ops have been created that way. But you don't need, I mean, you could do a health co-op without that. Even Canada actually has health co-ops, even though they have a single-payer system. But they've done it as a way to make sure to bring more accessible health care to certain populations.
I was wondering, just obviously you didn't do much research on the internet. I was wondering where your research took you physically, to what libraries, to which archives, that kind of thing.
Schomburg Archives is part of the New York City Public Library, the Library of Congress, and the National Archives there. Is it Tougaloo University in Alabama?
Okay.
Also in Jackson, Mississippi, there's a historic society that has a name, but anyway, Jackson, Mississippi. Tulane University has the archives for the Federation of Southern Cooperatives. If truth be told, I didn't physically go to all those places. I actually had some helpers.
Oh.
I had some volunteer workers who went and got some of the archives for me. But I did go to the Northeast ones. I also, the lawyer for the Federation of Southern Cooperatives let me into his office to look at all his files, confidential files. That was in Atlanta. Also, Chicago has all the files, has most of the files for the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. So some are in the National Archives at the Library of Congress. There's one other place. Oh, and then Minnesota, actually, Tom Pearson.
Oh, great.
Did some digging for me in Minnesota.
Where in Minnesota?
There's the Historical Society of Minnesota, I think it is, has cooperative archives.
I see.
And so he was looking for some other reasons for stuff, but every time he saw something about black or a black person or a name Negro or something, he would make a copy of it and send it to me. So we found a black family that was very much involved. Actually, some of that stuff came too late to be in this book, so it'll be in the next one. But yeah, it was really nice that I actually got people who were like, oh, I have to go do this for something else. Do you want me to look out for you? And so, yeah, it was very much a group effort in that sense. And there's a lot more. I mean, even those files that I went to, there was more stuff. Sometimes I just was doing as fast as I could to get some basic information. That's why I also say some of it, there is no more information, but some of it you need more time and more of an historian. I'm actually an economist, not an historian. So there was some stuff that was a little beyond my skills to tease out and to find and stuff. And then the other place that was really rich was black newspapers. So Pittsburgh Courier, the Messenger, the Black World, the Black Worker, the Crisis. Those are the other places. And there you just have to go through microfiche and look at try to scan for keywords and headlines.
Had you thought about doing any sort of historical work before the 1900s, or has there been other work that you were looking at where we're looking more at like cultural transference and in-period colonization? So how does cooperative economics or economic justice work on plantation slavery situations, right?
So yes and no. There is stuff in the book from the 17 and 1800s, not necessarily looking at plantation society, but just trying to find any reference to economic cooperation. And in those days, they weren't called co-ops because the term co-op really started after the Rochdale pioneers in 1844, and the Europeans codified cooperatives in 1896 when they started the International Cooperative Association. So nobody, not just black people, but nobody was calling them co-ops. That's why we had to go back to the mutual aid societies and just looking at any kind of cooperation. So on plantations, what we found were people farming together. So these, what they call them, kitchen gardens and side gardens. They could only really do it on Sundays because that's the only day they had any time off, but they were doing cultivation, and in some cases they were making some money off of those crops which some of them pooled to buy each other out of freedom, out of slavery, to buy each other into freedom out of slavery. So there's that level. There is also the Maroon societies, runaway escaped blacks who were either escaping to Native American villages or into the woods and creating their own communes, and those were very communalistic, cooperative societies where you pretty much farmed together. They probably might have had their own house, but everything else was pretty much the whole community. And then just before the end of enslavement, just before the Civil War in the late 1850s and early 60s, there were actually deliberate black communities created, sometimes in the South, but most of them were created in the Midwest and actually in Canada. And these were often white masters were buying up land, putting their enslaved people on it, and quote-unquote teaching them how to live as if they were free. So giving them the land, getting them to cultivate it as a collective, and then in 20 years or 10 years, you worked off your freedom and they would give you your freedom papers and the land. And so they were creating these sort of artificial communities that were similar to sort of the socialist utopian communities that the whites were doing. So there were some of those. Some of them were made from escaped people doing it on their own, but some of them were actually white patriarchs trying to do this. So there were those are sort of some of the precursors. And then the mutual aid societies sort of morphed into mutual insurance companies. So even still during enslavement, but in some of the free populations, especially Richmond and North Philadelphia, et cetera, there might be some mutual insurance, black-owned mutual insurance companies, which are essentially also co-ops. And then those might morph into banks. So there were all different kinds of things happening.
Back to the publication ideas. Has there been any talk of translating the book into other languages?
Not yet, but hopefully. I think the next thing is to do ebook, I think, but I don't even know when exactly they're doing that. And I don't know when they're doing European market, but I just had someone email me from Sweden asking me.
I was thinking Sweden.
Yeah, she was just asking me when, you know, well, how she could get the book, but if I thought it would get distributed to Sweden anytime soon. And actually, I forgot to answer her. So I'm glad you mentioned that.
Have you thought when you're going to do your next book on this?
Yeah, so I originally thought I was going to do it by next year, because I actually had to cut about a third of that. That book is about a third of what I had, and I was so mad about it. I was like, okay, I'm just going to write the next book and get it all out. Then I got really tired. And then, now I've been on the book circuit, I have almost no time for any writing at all. So I figured I should give myself a rest, maybe another 6 months or so, and then try to decide what the next book will be. Though I'm thinking it's actually going to be a set of essays about the topic. So somebody already asked me if I would write about black housing co-ops. Somebody else asked me, there's a new, the next president of the Rural Electrics is supposed to be a black man. And so someone wants me to tell the story about blacks in the leadership of the Rural Electrics. I've been wanting to do a history of black credit union movement. And I have 2 people who've been writing about it, but they don't. Anyway, so I'm thinking about kind of having chapters like that. I also have, there's a long theory chapter that never got into that book, using Du Bois's theory of economic cooperation and pulling that in with some of the other economists and sociologists and trying to develop a theory of subaltern cooperative economic development. So that would be a chapter or 2. So that's what I'm thinking now, is thinking of it not as a narrative, but as chapters dealing with different pieces.
Do you plan on doing anything about how the mechanisms that were used to steal black-owned land? There's a lot of ground, and I think it's important to do something about that, so people don't get the idea that blacks have never had any land,
and just squandered it.
Just squandered it, you know, because there's really a lot to be said about the nefarious techniques that were used to rob millions of acres from
Yeah,
black
that's a
ownership?
good question. I hadn't thought about having it in this book, but you're right, I probably could figure out a way. Especially, it could be another chapter on the Federation of Southern Cooperatives, but from that perspective.
Yes.
And how they then used co-ops to help support, strengthen, and stabilize black land ownership. Because I sort of say that in the chapter this time, but I don't really. The other thing I thought about doing in the second volume was doing a much more of an economic analysis of what the impact of the co-ops were on these communities. Because mostly right now I've just been able to document that they existed, who started them, if they were able to give a dividend or not, and what business they were in, right? But now if I could actually take a few of them at least and really say, how did they really impact their community? What did they really do? That one's going to be hard because most of these co-ops, I don't have any information like that. But where I could find that information, I was thinking of doing a few chapters like that also to give people a better sense of what those benefits and impacts are. So there's a lot of ways to go. That's the other problem. There's every time I think about doing something else, there's like I could do this, or that. And so actually my real call now is for other people. I need grad students, I need people on the ground, I need grassroots people to write their own histories for their own locality or their own family. I need grad students to start to take on this work. I would even co-author the book with someone if they were willing to help, because it gets a little... There's so many different ways that we could go. Right.
Can you talk more about process of the creation of the co-op and continuation of it? I guess kind of going back again to the black versus whatever white or other people of color groups, was there anything specific about how the process happened that was distinctive?
Process is pretty much the same. One of the reasons why the mutual aid societies and a lot of the early co-ops were founded by religious institutions and fraternities and sororities or fraternal organizations was because to do cooperative economics, you do have to trust one another. You do have to have some sense of solidarity. It could be sort of racial, political solidarity, but it's also easier if it's real social solidarity, right? So people who are willing to share, because you have to share resources, right? You have to be willing to trust somebody. You're putting in your resources, and you have to trust that people are going to be good stewards of it. So that is really for any co-op, but particularly for blacks, that's partly why I was thinking about this subaltern cooperative economic development notion, is it seemed like subaltern groups would even have more sense of solidarity, more sense of cohesion, more sense of the need for why they would want to economically cooperate together. And so that kind of motivation helps. I think maybe the black co-ops also had to use a lot more in-kind sweat equity kind of stuff because they didn't always have a lot of else to give. So there's maybe a lot more bartering and using sweat equity and putting in the time and energy without any compensation. But I don't want to really claim that, because for most co-ops, that's one of the strengths of them, why they actually operate well, is because people are willing not to punch the clock in terms of how much they're putting in, because they see that what they're putting in is so much more valuable than whether they got paid for that time or got equity in exchange for that time. But certainly for blacks, that was clearly something, because so many of them really had so few resources, that was something. The other part of the process is, though, the stages, right? You do really have to come together with a group that decides what the need is. Then you really have to have some kind of plan for, is it feasible to do this business? Do you have some kind of business plan? Then you do have to figure out what's the decision-making mechanism? How are we going to make decisions together? Why would we do that? So there's lots of different stages that, again, anybody has to go through to make a co-op work. And some groups, and I don't mean this biracial, I mean some co-op groups do it better than others. Usually the ones that have figured out how to relate to each other, how to make decisions together, how to respect each other's time, do better and last longer. But it's also true that sometimes the groups that have a little bit more resources and equity to put in also last longer, because the strain isn't as hard. So that's why a lot of groups will tell you got to get the capitalization in place before you do it. That's sort of the more realistic piece, right? But then there's some groups that just by sheer determination do it even though they don't have the money exactly in place. So it's hard to give you any...
Yeah, I guess part of what I'm wondering about is whether or not there's cultural differences that happen too, because, you know, white culture, black culture, Asian culture, whatever, each of these different cultures, the way in which people form groups and the way in which the process can be different. And I wasn't sure, you know.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I probably should have a better answer for it, but I don't. And I'm trying to think why I don't have a good answer to it. And I think partly, even though I partly agree with you, because I do agree that different groups have different cultural strengths and different ways that they express their culture and affinities, but I also actually believe that every group has a culture of cooperation and solidarity. We just often ignore it or don't see it. So I've tried not to say, you know, whites and Asians know how to cooperate better and blacks and Latinos don't, or because I don't really think that's true. Oftentimes the issue is really about circumstances, not about whether they have the culture of doing it.
I guess what I mean is, like, in process, like, for example, I was just in a class, we were talking about popular education, and saying that, like, in certain, like, nonprofit industrial complex, right, they start out with evaluation as, like, this is how we start, and then we'll move into building community, right? And wondering if, you know, different groups say, like, okay, we're going to start with, like, the building community, how you said, you know, we started with a study group first, and then from there we move to this. I guess.
Yeah, it's a good question. So I guess I haven't really looked at it that much. I think it has been coming up, though, in the co-op development world, because there are different strategies, especially I've been working on it from looking at developing worker co-ops, and there are different strategies, like some of the support groups actually do. They think you have to start with what's the viable business, get everybody on the same page about how to run that business, and then as an afterthought you can worry about collective decision-making and empowerment and how to, right? And then there's other groups that say if you don't start with the ownership culture and collective decision-making, there's no co-op there, so don't call it a co-op, and you can always figure out the business once you got the cohesion. So we do have those kind of, but it's actually not, at least in the co-op world right now, it's not a racial distinction, right? It's more about strategy and who's leading the development. But you might be right, especially in terms of sort of the popular education, how to get through to people so that the model makes sense. There may be some differences. Certainly, one of the hopes I had with this book, and I think it's working, is I just wanted black people in particular, but anybody, to see that black people have this tradition. It's not alien to us. It's not something outside of us, and we've done it before, and so we can do it again. And in some ways, to me, that was the important place to start, right? To say we're not importing something from some other culture, some other age, right? We're doing something that's integral, organic to our people, and so we can do this. So in that sense, I guess that's sort of how I would answer that, is to show how we've done it and that we can do it.
It's close to 8, and yeah, we could sit all night.
Is there one more
I think
comment?
Michelle has one.
I had a question.
Go right ahead. I don't think we've heard your voice. We like hearing all voices at first.
I did talk, but I'm just curious because I know I actually saw that it was a university press, but I don't know your background, and you said you're an economist, and a lot of my assumptions about economists are working on market mechanisms that lift up free market economy, and so as an intellectual, I'm kind of curious what sorts of challenges you've come into in writing this book from folks in your field that seem so dominant by free market ideology.
Yeah, it's a great question. So I am a political economist, actually. There's two of us here. And I haven't been that well received by my profession. Certainly black political economists have been much more interested in this work and much more supportive. the rest of the economic world has been very skeptical, but I'm actually used to it because I did my Ph.D. on the use of capital controls in newly industrializing countries, which is also another topic that mainstream economists hate and have decided don't work. So for some reason, the two things I spent most of my economic life doing are things that mainstream economists have already said were failures and can't possibly work. And I tried to show in both cases that they do work, specifically under specific conditions and for specific reasons. So I've always been kind of an outlier. I don't even teach in an economics department. I actually teach in an Africana studies department because I also started out in literature, so I'm not only an economist, so I'm very interdisciplinary. And that actually helped me in this co-op work and co-op research, because understanding social capital, not just finance capital, understanding community organizing, wanting to be concerned about economic justice is really not something my field embraces. But to me, it was actually the reason to become an economist, so that I could challenge the field, and I wanted to figure out how to make economics a liberatory science, not so much of a constraining science. So hopefully I've helped a little bit. But yeah, I'm not that highly prized in my profession.
We're all happy.
We're your prize here.
Thank you.
Well, speaking of being highly prized, one of the things we like to do at Source Booksellers with our events is to give some feedback to our guests.
Yeah.
So all of you can say one or two words about your experience tonight with our guest, Jessica. Yes. Okay, everybody start. Somebody.
Go in a circle.
Oh, you're going to take that, so you're going to take the criticism word.
I can stop if you like.